Hey guys, iKailaKai here, and today I'm going to take a bit of a step back from gameplay videos and look over the most recent and final OP11 championship that happened in Japan. I'm going to be re-commentating over the tournament that happened the other day in English and giving my input and thoughts on the decks that are played within this meta to give you a little bit more context as a viewer. First of all, I'm not an official Bandai representative. My opinions are my own, and I will link the actual live stream in the description if you'd rather watch that instead. The reception on my other videos commentating over the championship were very well received, but I personally wasn't really sure if I really wanted to put out more of these videos because to me it felt kind of low effort. But after a lot of thinking and a lot of people telling me that I should put out more of this because they enjoy my insight, here's another one. So let me know if you really want more of this because I can very easily, honestly, put out a lot of this kind of content. I just don't know how actually necessary it is for you guys. The match that we're going to be commentating over today is one that I thought would be very interesting, Blue Purple Luffy against Green Yellow Law. Now to give some context, although Green Yellow Law seems to kind of have popped out of nowhere, Green Yellow Law at the very start of the meta was actually very popular. I'm not a Green Yellow Law player, so I can't say exactly where this deck has its strengths and weaknesses. I imagine that it's the other matchups besides Blue Purple Luffy that really took this deck down because it was established very early on as one of the premier Blue Purple Luffy counters. After a little bit of time, people eventually switched over to decks like Red Zoro and Philipetti, although whether or not Zoro actually beats Blue Purple Luffy is another debate. But we haven't really seen this deck in a long time. However, the top 16 match, which I'm sorry we did skip over, showed a different Green Yellow Law player. So we had two Green Yellow Laws in the top 16, which statistically, of the number of people who bring this deck, is very odd. Green Yellow Law, as a leader, he wants to have 5 Dong worth of cards on his board to actually start using his leader effect and playing things out, and to do that, he really wants to have searchers in the early game. Right now, he only has Bonnie, and Bonnie only being one cost, he does need to find other things from either the search or his draws to actually be able to start using his leader effect well. But if he can manage to find these cards, he already has very good targets in especially the Cavendish. This Cavendish is very pivotal for Green Yellow Law because it allows him to not only use his leader effect or cards a lot more easily, but also can give him a lot more firepower in these matchups where the opponent has 6,000 power, for example. Starting the game, Green Yellow starts with playing Ibani, and he picks up the 5-cost Bonnie. This 5-cost Bonnie actually can be very relevant into Blue Purple Luffy depending on the curve, because it can deny the opponent's very key turns, or deny them from leaving up extra dong at the end of their turn to have more defensive plans. What he finds from this Bonnie may actually change the game very... Ooh, okay. He finds the one cost Luffy, and this one cost Luffy gets to search another Supernova. This deck has a lot of different ways to search cards in the deck, so although maybe you might not have things like the Cavendish in your starting hand, it's very easy to find it through the multiple means of searching. Even with the new start deck that's coming out in a couple of days for the West and in about a month for the East, there's another Supernova searcher in Kid and Killer. And all of these cards being able to search the same archetype makes the deck a lot more consistent. And one actually very important thing, especially for Green Yellow Law, is because he needs to make his board 5 costs. Having these cards that, although they're more expensive to play, just increase the cost on your board, like for example the Carmel that some people choose to run, actually make it quite beneficial for this sort of deck to just have a Kid and Killer that can just be on the board, be a searcher, but be a 2-cost. Blue Purple Luffy on his 4-dong turn only really has Bonglei to play, and I don't believe that Green Yellow really has ways to affect the board, especially this early on. We know from his hand that he just doesn't have a way to deal with it, unless the far right card is something that can deal with it. He plays the Cavendish, so now he has 5 dong worth of characters on the field, and with the dong that he got back from Cavendish's effect, he can attach the dong onto his leader, and to then use his leader effect if he chooses to. He decides not to in this case, though, and take the game a little bit more slowly. This new Bidge is actually very powerful. It's a blocker, but when one of your Supernova type characters leaves the field, you can instead put that card to the top of your life. When you think about it in the context of this matchup, generally is denying 9-cost Mom. And 9-cost Mom, a card that already sends cards to life, doesn't feel like it makes a huge difference. But Bedge being able to control where the card goes, either ignoring the effect and letting it go to the bottom of your life, or using Bedge's effect to put the card to the top of the life, means that it's set up already for you to be able to immediately play it back onto the board with your leader effect. In this way, the Bedge existing, although it doesn't necessarily defend your characters from being removed, it makes it so that they can very easily come back onto the board through Law's leader effect. Blue Purple Luffy now on his turn, decides not to ramp with the gear second, but instead play the 5-cost Nami. If he ramps with the gear second here, then he will be at 10 dong on the next turn. And I don't see a reason why he wouldn't want to do this. Perhaps he's afraid of the green yellow law's aggressive potential. I believe that he has left one up dong up, which means that most likely what he's afraid of right now is green yellow law taking a very aggressive turn with the Cavendish on the board to try to put him down to like 1 life on the next turn. However, because the blue purple Luffy is still at 3 life, I don't necessarily think that he's in a dangerous spot considering that green yellow law doesn't have access to cards like Pudding. If it was me, I would probably just, although it doesn't feel very efficient with your dong, use the gear second to just get to 10 dong as quickly as possible to make sure that you can combat with things such as the 7-cost law that can come out on this 7 dong turn. This 7-cost law coming out on this turn is very scary because not only does he get to add a character to his life, but because he gets to attach a dong from the law effect to his leader, he can immediately play the card that's on his life straight onto the board if he chooses to. Obviously, he can also just leave the card to be able to give himself some more defensive potential, but because he has 4 life here and Blue Purple Luffy's board is honestly not very threatening at the moment, he could just use his leader effect to be able to create a more offensive board state. I don't think that Blue Purple Luffy really needed to leave up the dong for gear second here because most times Green Yellow Law is going to end up playing this 7-cost law, which means that he's only going to be hitting for 6k and then potentially 7 or 8k with the leader law. But perhaps he wanted to go for the higher expected value play, not knowing the matchup as well. Nonetheless, though, although Blue Purple Luffy will still be at 9 dong next turn, he's going to be in a spot where he can play the 9-cost Luffy 2 board guaranteed. It just means that he's not going to be in a spot where he can high roll with something like the 7-cost Sanji, or 9-cost Sanji into something else within his top 5 through his leader effect. Law uses his leader effect and starts to do some really crazy things. Effectively for free in a way. He's been able to play out the 5-cost law onto the board, and through the 5-cost law, be able to play the Searcher once again, to be able to find another 7-cost law, which is likely going to come onto the board next turn. He set up a board state that's pretty hard to deal with, because not only is this Cavendish getting a lot of value right now, but the 7-cost law that's come onto the field is going to start getting very early value due to the fact that Blue Purple Luffy hasn't been able to establish a high power threat on the board yet. Nonetheless, though, I think Blue Purple Luffy's priority right now is to try to get rid of this Cavendish as best as he possibly can. However, the interesting thing to me is that the turn before this, when he played the 5-cost Nami, he put the 9-cost Mom that he drew from the top 3 cards to the bottom of his deck, meaning that he doesn't have it to play on this turn. Although this Cavendish would end up coming back again with the leader effect due to Bage's effect being able to defend it if he did play 9-cost Mom here, I believe that if he just played the 9-cost Mom on this turn to just prevent the Cavendish from hitting as well as giving you 2 active dong, would slow down Law's aggressive potential in this early game and put Blue Purple Luffy in a spot where he can easily connect that into his leader ability. Instead, he's opted for a plan where he was likely planning to play 9-cost Luffy, but perhaps the 8-cost card that he drew could give him another option. He decides instead to go for an aggressive plan on leader. So he's thinking, I guess, that he's not going to actually play for board. He's not going to try to out-control this aggressive deck. He's going to race this deck. Whether or not this is actually going to be a viable strategy is yet to be seen, but Blue Purple Luffy is a deck that's historically weak to aggressive decks, and trying to take an aggressive plan against one of these decks can be very, very scary. Nonetheless, though, Green Yellow Law being a 4-life leader can kind of be susceptible to these aggressive plans as well. So perhaps Blue Purple Luffy, by some miracle, has some experience in this matchup and is playing according to this plan, where he knows that perhaps Green Yellow Law doesn't have that many defensive capabilities, but I don't necessarily even think that that's true. Green Yellow Law, as we can see already, he has the 2-cost Veg and the 5-cost Law, and Blue Purple Luffy not being able to deal with blockers very well. Effectively, these count as extra life. This 9,000 attack from the Bonkley to the leader, if it's blocked with any of these characters, effectively has become 5,000 character for Green Yellow Law. So even though Green Yellow Law looks like he only has 6 cards in his hand with 2 life, all of these cards on the board become very, very threatening over time because Green Yellow Law has so many ways to cycle and recycle these cards. Nonetheless, though, Blue Purple Luffy still going for this aggressive plan. Besides, now that the Green Yellow Law has blocked with the 5 Cuss Law, that he's going to go for board, switching his plan to a more defensive plan now that he realizes that he can't really go for this aggressive plan on this turn at the very least. The 9 Cuss Luffy here ends up getting rid of the 2 Cuss Bedge, as you would expect, but that means that Green Yellow Law is now in a spot where he can play his second 7 Cuss Law and still have Cavendish on the board to keep accruing value. However, this is a turn where it starts to get tricky whether or not he actually wants to use his leader effect. Last turn, there was no reason not to use your leader effect, because once, if he's at 4 life, the opponent only has 2 actual threats on the board, you don't really need to have any more defensive options. Whereas now that he doesn't have any blockers on the board, and after the Secret Rare Laws effect has 3 life, if he uses his leader effect to go down to 2, but play out a character, if this character isn't a blocker, he is putting him in a spot where Blue-Purple Luffy's aggressive attacks on the leader start to actually become threatening. The Green Yellow Law chooses to hit with the Cavendish first just to get the 2 active Dong, to make it so that the opponent doesn't really know what he's going to potentially do with the rest of his Dong. He hits into Nami, trying to get Blue-Purple Luffy down to a spot where he's either not going to be able to defend his board due to lack of counter, or dies trying. He cut an Usohachi importantly, and by cutting an Usohachi for what should have been a 1k attack gives the opponent a lot of information. Not only does it say that you don't have any decent 1ks that you want to throw away, such as Zorojiro or Banklei, but it also tells the opponent that you only have Usohachi left. Because Usohachi is the last 2k that you want to cut in your hand generally for these types of purple decks, it shows the opponent that you're going really, really low on 2ks. Which means that if this law hits into the 9-cost Luffy right now, because Blue-Purple Luffy doesn't have any active Dong, it's very likely that this 9-cost Luffy dies, regardless of any sort of hand information. I'm very scared that he just tried to rest that when he didn't have any Dong on it. I'm not sure if I would have done that. So he's committed to hitting the board a couple of times earlier, and he forced Blue-Purple Luffy to use 2-2Ks. While yes, he does have the 5-cost Bonnie to be able to lock the 9-cost Luffy to not let it attack the next turn, if Blue-Purple Luffy plays something like 9-cost Sanji into another threat the next turn, the number of threats on Blue-Purple Luffy's board still becomes a problem over the next couple of turns because you can't play Bonnie to lock everything. If he were to put Dong onto his 7-cost, onto the 7-cost Law to hit into the 9-cost Luffy, to either make Luffy go down to maybe 1 card if he has enough counter, or just to get rid of the 9-cost Luffy in general, he could instead use the Bonnie to either lock a Dong to make it so it's harder and harder to use the event counters that he's likely has in his hand, or he could just not play it at all to have a more defensive plan into the Blue-Purple Luffy, who now has a devastatingly weak board. I don't know if I would have done what he did in this situation. He ends up going for kind of a mix between the offensive and defensive plans, focusing the opponent's board to get counter, and not being able to capitalize on the fact that the opponent used a lot of his counter, and Usohachi at that. Instead, opting to go for life, meaning that Blue-Purple Luffy now has a little bit more cards and a little bit more breathing room to be able to play out the next couple of turns. Whether or not this 9-cost Luffy being on the board still is going to bite him later on is yet to be seen, but this is the sort of thing that, although it feels very good right now, and the 9-cost Luffy being stunned by the 5-cost Bonnie is something that is very nice on this specific turn. If you can't continuously do this every single turn, this 9-cost Luffy eventually will stand up and it'll eventually become a very problematic attacker. Yeah, this hurts for the Blue-Purple Luffy because right now, although his board is very big, he really only has 1 character that can hit, and 1 character which, if he does hit, can potentially put him in a spot where the opponent can try to go for game. The likely play that Blue-Purple Luffy has to go for in this situation is that because he doesn't really have the board to be able to contest with Green Yellow Law, he might want to commit to the aggressive plan that he was going for early on. The issue with this, though, is that Green Yellow Law still has a blocker on the field. Because of this blocker, he effectively has 3 effective life, and because Blue-Purple Luffy has cut Usohachi in the turns before, the likelihood of him having more, while not impossible, and this means that the Green Yellow Law might feel a lot more safe on these sorts of turns to actually take these sorts of attacks because the threat of Izohachi is a lot lower. Blue-purple Luffy on this turn likely only has the option to play the 8-cost Katakuri in his hand because none of the other cards in his hand are really worth it. And this 8-cost Katakuri is nice because it allows you to also use Gum Giant on the next turn without actually going into the range of not being able to use your leader effect. But it doesn't actually make his... it doesn't actually increase the strengths of Blue-purple Luffy as a deck because he wasn't able to weave it in with something like Sanji. Right now, Green Yellow Law is still ahead on the board state, and this Cavendish has probably restood up to 8 Dong at this point. So much value coming out of this one card that Blue-purple Luffy hasn't been able to deal with, despite the chance to. I understand why he didn't want to play the 9-cost Mom in the turns before, because he was going for this more aggressive plan, but by going for this aggressive plan and not getting rid of this Cavendish, he's given so much value to the opponent that can help the Green Yellow Law translate it into a win within the next couple of turns if he can manage to play it correctly and Blue-purple Luffy doesn't do something stupid like Blue-purple Luffy always does. Green Yellow Law starting with an 8,000 attack to leader. This is a really nice threshold to start at. By hitting at 8,000 here, generally you want to counter with Gear 2, sorry, in English, which the Blue-purple Luffy has. If he cuts Gear 2nd here, though, he can't use Gum Giant because he only has 1 Dong active. And this 1 Dong active really wants to be used on Giant because not only does he have a break in his hand, but he only has a couple of cards of counter. If he uses Gear 2nd here and goes down to 4 cards in hand, it makes it very easy for the opponent to math out and try to have a really threatening state. As such, an 8,000 attack here either is forcing the opponent to counter with 2k, 1k, or it goes through like it did here. The Blue-purple Luffy player does not want to use Gear 2nd here, Gear 2, and Green Yellow Law is trying to trick him into using Gear 2nd, Gear 2. The interesting thing now is that now that Blue-purple Luffy has taken this attack, it feels optimal to go for an even higher attack to the 7-cost Law. Ooh. Hold on, let's first see what's going on here. Green Yellow Law uses his leader effect to bounce back the 5-cost Bonnie, but does not play anything out of his life. You can just pay the cost of being able to bounce a character back to your hand, but not actually have the outcome happen. It'll be interesting to see if he decides to play the 5-cost Bonnie on this turn to be able to lock the opponent's 9-cost Luffy one more time, or if he decides to go for something like 8-cost Kid. I think that optimally you want to really try to be more aggressive on Blue-purple Luffy to force him to use these for example, Gum Giant like he did, on really inopportune attacks like 10k from Law instead of 9k. By hitting 9k, he made it really easy for Blue-purple Luffy to be able to counter out the attack. If he hit at 10k, it'd make it a lot more awkward because the opponent still doesn't know exactly what's going to happen. 8-cost Kid ends up using 9 Dong because you have to attach 1 Dong to him, so he doesn't really have the extra Dong to be able to play out the turn. Yes, this does put a lot of defensive pressure on the opponent to be able to defend your board and your life simultaneously. But if you were to play the 5-cost Bonnie, then he could have defended one of the opponent's attacks in not letting the 9-cost Luffy attack to make sure that he doesn't lose the next turn at the very least due to the high number of cards in his hand, while also giving him the extra floating Dong to attach onto his characters to be a lot more aggressive on the Blue-purple Luffy to be able to try to close out the game in the next turn or so. Blue-purple Luffy in his search sees both Gravity Blade as well as Red Rock. This Gravity Blade he definitely would have wanted to see much earlier on, even though the 2-cost Bedge could have defended it. This is likely why the Green Yellow Law player blocked with the 5-cost Law and not the 2-cost Bedge, to make sure that he could still play around cards like Gravity Blade that could get rid of his board, and instead can send them to life with Bedge's effect. Blue-purple Luffy picks up the Red Rock and sends the rest to his bottom. He saw things like Gum Giant, but he doesn't really have any other good cards that he really wants to draw off of them. He uses the 6 Dong on the 8-cost Kid because there's really no other option here. And now, does he try to go for lethal? He's in a spot where he might feel threatened to, where if he doesn't go for lethal on this turn, he's guaranteed to die on the next turn. And the fact that he drew 9-cost Sanji this late into the game is really detrimental for him, because not only does he not have Gum Giant to be able to get rid of the card and turn it into advantage, he's in a spot now where he only has 5,000 counter facing a Green Yellow Law that has 3 massive threats on the board that give him back Dong with a leader effect that can very easily stall out the game for another turn if he chooses to. Blue-purple is going for leader. 7,000 leader, green yellow law, in a spot where he needs to defend at least one of these attacks to be able to survive onto the next turn. Every single card is in his counter. So this attack, being the cheapest of the 3 that are on the board at the very least, is the one that you're going to want to defend. And then now the 8,000 power attack from Katakuri as well as the 10,000 power attack from Luffy minimum can either be blocked or taken depending on if the green yellow player wants to try to go for another turn or if he wants to try to end the game next turn. If he decides to end the game next turn, then he just needs to defend his life enough that he doesn't die within this turn. But if he wants the game to go on for longer, he might need to consider where he wants to use his blockers. As we saw before with him using the Usohachi for counter, the threat of Usohachi actually being able to rest this Bonnie in the final turns is relatively low. Blue Purple Luffy, though, still potentially thinking about going for lethal here. As he still has the 5-cost Nami on the board, he can technically turn this character into a 9,000 power attack, going 8,000, 9,000, 10,000 at leader. He decides to go for 8,000 onto Cavendish here. Green Yellow Law counters with 3k from this 8,000 Katakuri attack, which means that this Luffy is most likely, instead of going to anywhere else, probably going to go to Cavendish, as he does here. This attack's most likely going to be blocked with Bonnie, meaning that Green Yellow Law now is in a spot where he doesn't have any blockers in his hand or on the board, though he can search for it through the 1-cost Luffys in his hand. But Blue Purple Luffy has 2 blockers on the board, 3 active Dong, and 1 life. In the opponent's eyes, this just seems like infinite counter. Whether or not this is a bluff, Green Yellow Law can't actually know, but the scary thing about Blue Purple Luffy is that these sorts of bluffs can actually win them the game. Green Yellow Law not feeling confident in his ability to go for a lethal on this turn, given the fact that Blue Purple Luffy has left up these many blockers as well as this many Dong, elects to go for a more defensive play to potentially find something like we just saw the 5-cost Law. This 5-cost Law can also easily replay the 1-cost Luffy that ended up that was just played to be able to search through his deck even more. So perhaps he can find enough defensive cards to be able to. Ooh, does he not go for it? Picks up the 3-cost Bonnie. Wait. Oh, so by playing the Bonnie, by just being a blocker. Oh, you take your life there? Hold on. If you play Bonnie just as a blocker and it's pay 5 to use the 5-cost Bonnie to lock the opponent's Luffy from attacking, then effectively you stop 1 attack through the Bonnie, you stop 2 attacks with the other Bonnie, you have your leader to hit into the 1 life, which stops another attack, which means that the Nami would have to go for the final attack. Maybe the amount of counters and just isn't enough to be able to defend that even, so he still has to go for this play. Still though, you can just play Bonnie as a blocker and not actually use the effect. I feel like this Blue Purple Luffy, with his 9-cost Luffy being able to stick onto the board for this long, has started to gain the advantage that we really didn't want it to have. If the Green Yellow Law was able to get rid of the Blue Purple Luffy's 9-cost Luffy when he had the chance, then perhaps he would have had a better time in this game. But this Luffy being able to accelerate the board state and really put pressure on the Green Yellow Law means that Green Yellow Law isn't really able to play his game that much. Okay, Law uses leader effect and plays out the Bonnie, locking out the Luffy like we said that might happen. But compared to the plan that I was having in mind, decides to just play the card out of his life, going down to 0 life, but with his 7-cost Law, being able to attach 1 card anyways. So, although this play for Green Yellow Law makes his board a lot more threatening, I feel like having the extra Dong after playing Bonnie not only makes his hand look more threatening because he would have 3 cards in his hand rather than 2, but it also makes it so that he has extra Dong to be able to play on his characters to make the Blue Purple Luffy actually counter out these attacks. Unfortunately, the last life from Blue Purple Luffy gave him 1k counter, which means that this 9k attack can be defended with block 1k for 2000 counter, which means that Blue Purple Luffy has been able to protect 1 extra attacker on the board. Now Blue Purple Luffy absolutely has to go for lethal, and this God Thread might just be the one. Although God Thread isn't a Straw Hat, he can set up the top of his deck to be able to draw into it, and if he used this God Thread on the 3-cost Bonnie that's on the field and attacks with the characters that he has on board, then he might just have enough damage. Green Yellow Law only having 2 cards in hand, that's a maximum of 2,000, 2,000, so 4,000 total counter in his hand, might be looking at defeat in the eyes of this very fun and interactive blue-purple Luffy deck. Decides to put the cards to his top, which means that we probably know what's coming. Picks up the God Thread. For 5 Dong, plays God Thread, gets rid of the Spawny. Yeah, and then with the rest of his Dong, he attaches 1 to Nami, hits at 7. If the attack goes through, you're guaranteed lethal. If the attack is defended, you could hit at anything with Luffy, and then it's just guaranteed lethal. No. Why does blue-purple Luffy always... I do think that the green yellow law wasn't really playing around the opponent's deck and was kind of playing towards the game plan that he had established in the beginning of the game. The blue purple Luffy continuously gave green yellow law opportunities to be able to take back his board through attacks, but green yellow law didn't take them, instead opting to create the powerful board that was likely able to win him the blue purple Luffy matchup throughout the preliminary rounds. As a blue purple Luffy player, my first instinct in this matchup would be to be very defensive and not actually go for the opponent's life. But perhaps by this blue purple Luffy player going very, very aggressive, electing to play things like 9-cost Luffy over the options like 9-cost Mama, 8-cost Cutting that he had on these turns, he put the green yellow law in a spot that he wasn't really sure how to play out. The green yellow law, instead of going for the opponent's board to just make sure that blue purple Luffy couldn't have this offensive option, decides to stick to his main game plan of making his board stronger and slowly trying to out attrition blue purple Luffy. Unfortunately, this time it did not work out for the green yellow law player, and that was the end of Green Yellow Law's run in this championship run. But he was still able to make top 8 with a very, very good record on the day. I think I talked a little bit too fast in some sections, so maybe let me know if I've been a bit overwhelming and I can kind of tune it back, maybe get a couple of people on for next time. Thank you guys for watching this video. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll make more for the next championship because it's going to be in OP12, and that's the one that I'm really excited for. And at least looking at my recent statistics, seems like you guys are being excited for it too. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.